You've been taught to explain yourself. From childhood, you've been conditioned to justify every decision, every preference, every moment when you don't conform to others. Expectations. You're expected to explain why you're late, why you said no, why your dreams don't match someone else's plans for your life. You apologize for your ambition, your boundaries, your very existence. They demand explanations, and you comply, believing this will earn you respect, trust, inclusion, and acceptance. You could not be more wrong. This cultural programming has created a generation of people who live in constant justification mode, forever explaining their choices to audiences who never asked for their vote in the first place. You defend your career path to relatives who chose security over risk. You justify your relationship standards to friends who settled for less. You explain your financial decisions to people drowning in debt. You apologize for success to those who fear attempting it. Every explanation you offer is a small surrender of sovereignty. Each justification chips away at your authority over your own life. You've been convinced that transparency equals authenticity, that vulnerability builds connection, that explaining your reasoning demonstrates thoughtfulness and consideration. In reality, these habits create the opposite effect. They signal insecurity, invite manipulation, and establish you as someone whose decisions are subject to external approval. Machiavelli saw through this centuries ago. He understood that explanation is almost always surrender, a move that shrinks your power and inflates the status of whoever demands it. Men in general judge more by the eye than by the hand, he wrote. The world is moved by the spectacle of certainty, not the monologue of insecurity. People respond to decisive action, not detailed reasoning. They follow leaders who act with conviction, not those who require consensus for every move. The more you explain, the more you reveal your dependence on their approval. The more you justify, the more you diminish your own authority. The more you seek understanding, the more you position yourself as someone whose decisions require external validation to be legitimate. Stop explaining yourself. Today, you'll discover why this simple shift represents one of the most powerful transformations you can make in how others perceive and treat you. Here is the truth no one tells you. Strong leaders, powerful strategists, and genuinely respected individuals almost never justify their decisions to casual observers. They act with conviction and let others scramble to interpret the logic. They create enough space for curiosity, controversy, and conversation, but they keep their internal motivations protected. This isn't arrogance or dismissiveness. This is strategic self-preservation and authority maintenance. Understanding why explanation weakens your position requires examining the psychological dynamics it creates. When you explain yourself extensively, you unconsciously communicate several damaging messages: that your decision-making process is open for debate, that you're uncertain enough to require external validation, that others have the right to judge your choices, and that their approval is necessary for your actions to be legitimate. Consider the difference between these responses to criticism. I chose this path because I've always been interested in creative work, and I know the money isn't great. But I think passion is more important than salary, and I've read about people who followed their dreams and succeeded. So I'm hoping that if I work hard enough, versus this is the direction I've chosen. The first response invites further questioning, debate, and judgment. The second establishes a boundary and maintains authority. When you explain, you hand your critics and competitors a blueprint to your mind. They learn what you fear, where you doubt yourself, what makes you feel exposed and defensive. This intelligence becomes ammunition for future attacks on your confidence and decision-making. They discover which buttons to push, which insecurities to target, which fears to exploit when they want to destabilize your resolve. The psychology of explanation reveals a deeper problem. It often stems from childhood conditioning where you learned that your choices were subject to adult approval. This programming continues into adulthood, where you unconsciously seek permission from bosses, friends, family members, and even strangers for decisions that should be entirely your own. You've never fully claimed ownership of your right to choose your path without external validation. Furthermore, extensive explanations rarely achieve their intended purpose. You believe that if you just make yourself clear enough, people will understand, forgive, accept, and support you. The reality is far different. Critics don't become supporters because you explained your reasoning thoroughly. Skeptics don't transform into believers because you justified your choices eloquently. Often, your explanations simply provide new angles for them to attack your decisions. Each detail you share becomes a potential vulnerability. When you explain that you left your previous job because of poor management, you signal that you might be difficult to manage. When you justify your relationship choices by criticizing past partners, you reveal your tendency toward blame and inability to take responsibility. When you defend your business decisions by explaining market conditions, you show that you make excuses rather than adapt to challenges. The act of explanation also positions you in a fundamentally subordinate role. The person demanding explanations assumes the position of judge, while you assume the position of defendant. This dynamic, once established, becomes difficult to reverse. They learn that they can question your choices and expect detailed justification, while you learn to anticipate their criticism and prepare defensive responses. What if you refuse to explain yourself? What if you simply stood by your decisions with quiet confidence? Here's what actually happens, and it's the opposite of what most people expect. People lean in. They become more interested, not less. They try harder to figure you out rather than dismissing you as someone who overshares. Silence triggers projection. When you don't explain your motivations, others fill in the blanks with their own assumptions, often attributing more sophisticated reasoning to your choices than actually exists. You become a mystery, something increasingly rare in a world full of people desperate to confess their every thought and justify their every action. The less you say about your internal reasoning, the more your influence and authority multiply. People begin to assume that someone who doesn't feel compelled to explain themselves must have good reasons for their confidence. This principle operates across all contexts. In professional settings, the executive who issues clear directives without lengthy explanations commands more respect than one who constantly justifies decisions to subordinates. In social situations, the person who maintains boundaries without elaborate explanations is perceived as more confident and self-assured. In personal relationships, the individual who makes choices based on their own values without seeking constant validation appears more attractive and trustworthy. The refusal to explain yourself also prevents what might be called decision erosion. When you constantly justify your choices, you begin to doubt them yourself. The act of explanation forces you to examine every angle, consider every criticism, and question every assumption. This process, while sometimes valuable in private reflection, becomes destructive when performed publicly under pressure. Consider how this dynamic plays out in negotiations. The person who states their position and stands firm has more power than the one who feels compelled to explain every aspect of their reasoning. Explanations reveal your priorities, your constraints, your fears, and your flexibility. All information that skilled negotiators can use against you. The refusal to explain also protects you from the trap of over-justification, where the length and complexity of your explanation actually undermines your credibility. When someone asks why you made a particular choice and you respond with a 5-minute explanation covering every factor you considered, you appear uncertain rather than thoughtful. When you simply state your decision and move forward, you project confidence in your judgment. Now, imagine the reverse scenario. You're the one being challenged by someone demanding explanations. A manager questions your strategic approach. A partner demands justification for your personal goals. A family member prods into your private decisions. A colleague challenges your methodology. If you've developed the habit of explaining yourself extensively, you create an impossible debt. You must keep explaining, or else your legitimacy appears to vanish. This creates a psychological trap where your authority becomes dependent on your ability to justify yourself rather than your ability to produce results. You become trapped in a cycle where every decision requires explanation, every explanation invites more questions, and every question undermines your autonomy further. Machiavelli would say, "Never enter negotiations from a position of weakness. Never beg to be understood. Never allow others to establish themselves as judges of your choices. Instead, occupy the rarest ground in any interaction. Stand by your choices and let the results speak for themselves. When pressed for explanations, master the art of brief, non-defensive responses. That was my decision. This is my plan. I prefer this approach. These statements acknowledge the question without opening your decision-making process for debate. They maintain your authority while avoiding rudeness or dismissiveness. If pressed further, learn to pivot rather than dig deeper. Let's focus on what matters now, or results will prove it out, or I'm confident in this direction. These responses redirect attention from your internal reasoning to external outcomes, where your authority is less vulnerable to challenge. The skill of strategic non-explanation requires distinguishing between situations where some response is necessary and situations where detailed justification is expected but not required. With your boss, you might need to provide brief updates on your reasoning to maintain professional relationships. With curious acquaintances, you owe nothing beyond basic courtesy. Some will call this approach cold, aloof, or even arrogant. But consider the alternatives. Being constantly dissected by critics, consumed by the need for appeasement, diluted by endless justification cycles, and exhausted by the emotional labor of defending choices that should be entirely your own. Why is this approach so powerful psychologically? Because every extensive explanation is actually a plea for validation, for acceptance, for permission to make choices about your own life. It broadcasts your neediness and uncertainty to everyone who hears it. It signals that you don't fully trust your own judgment and require external confirmation to feel secure in your decisions. Suppose you're questioned in a boardroom or challenged in a social setting. The person who stays composed, confirms their decision, and moves forward without extensive commentary holds the room. They appear confident, decisive, and trustworthy. The over-explainer is remembered for nervous energy, insecurity, and inability to own their choices. Observe any genuinely dominant figure in any field. The leader who issues a verdict and moves on. The entrepreneur who announces a pivot without apologizing for the previous direction. The artist who creates work without explaining every creative choice. There, because I decided, ends debate, not because they're tyrannical, but because they've mastered the art of boundaries and self-ownership. Let's examine this principle even more deeply. Explaining yourself extensively is often a form of self-betrayal. It represents an unconscious apology for your convictions, an attempt to dilute responsibility if things go wrong. Well, the reason I did it becomes a preemptive excuse rather than ownership of outcomes. Machiavelli understood that real strength is contained and self-sufficient. Making decisions and owning them completely invites consequences, but explaining yourself never mitigates those consequences. It only multiplies your vulnerability by giving others more information to use against you when challenges arise. The practice of not explaining yourself also forces you to become more thoughtful about your actual decision-making process. When you know you won't be justifying every choice extensively, you're motivated to make better choices initially. You can't rely on post hoc explanations to make poor decisions seem reasonable, so you're compelled to think more carefully before acting. This creates a positive feedback loop. Better initial decisions lead to better outcomes, which build confidence in your judgment, which makes you less likely to seek external validation, which gives you more authority in future situations. The refusal to explain also protects your mental energy. The cognitive load of constantly justifying your choices is enormous. When you eliminate this burden, you free up mental resources for more productive activities, better planning, creative thinking, strategic analysis, and actual execution of your decisions. Furthermore, not explaining yourself eliminates the emotional drain of seeking approval from people whose opinions shouldn't matter to your life choices. You stop expending energy trying to convince others that your path is valid and start investing that energy in making your path successful. If you want to be genuinely respected and develop unshakable inner authority, here's your systematic practice. Own your no, own your yes, Make your reasoning private property. Transform your relationship with explanation from automatic habit to strategic choice. The integration begins with recognition. Most people explain themselves unconsciously, automatically responding to any hint of curiosity or criticism with detailed justification. Start by simply noticing these patterns. Count how many times per day you feel compelled to explain decisions that are entirely your own, your career choices, your spending habits, your relationship standards, your lifestyle preferences, your personal boundaries. This awareness creates the foundation for change. Once you recognize how often you automatically justify yourself, you can begin interrupting this pattern and choosing different responses. When someone presses for explanations, practice giving the briefest possible answer, then redirecting attention elsewhere. I chose this because it works for me, followed by, "What are you working on?" or "How's your project going?" This acknowledges their question without opening your decision-making process for extended discussion. If they persist in demanding more detailed explanations, learn to hold eye contact and let silence work for you. Most people are uncomfortable with silence and will fill it themselves, often revealing more about their motivations for questioning you than you revealed about your choices. Refuse the urge to demonstrate your virtue, your intelligence, or even your altruism through explanation. These qualities are better demonstrated through consistent action over time than through verbal justification in the moment. Your deeds, consistently applied, will carry more weight and credibility than any explanation ever could. Practice different types of responses for different situations. For professional contexts, "I'm confident this approach will deliver results," or "I'll update you on progress as we move forward." For personal relationships, "This feels right for me," or "I'm comfortable with this decision." For family situations, "I appreciate your concern, but I'm set on this direction." This isn't about stonewalling, disrespect, or refusing all communication. It's about raising the value of your words and your presence. When you speak less about your internal reasoning, people pay more attention when you do speak. When you're selective about what you explain, your explanations carry more weight. Keep your logic behind the curtain of your own mind. When you do address questions, keep responses focused on external factors rather than internal psychology. The timing was right for this move, rather than, "I felt like I needed a change because I was getting restless and uncertain about my future. My priorities have shifted," rather than, "I realized I was living according to other people's expectations and not my own values." The language you use matters enormously. Eliminate apologetic phrases. "I know this might seem weird, but I realize this doesn't make sense to everyone, but I probably should have consulted others, but..." These phrases signal that you don't fully own your choices and are seeking permission retroactively. Replace uncertainty markers with confident declarations. Instead of, "I think I want to try," use, "I'm pursuing." Instead of, "I hope this works out," use, "I expect this to succeed." Instead of, "Maybe I should have," use, "I chose to." Develop a repertoire of boundary-setting phrases that maintain relationships while protecting your authority. "I understand your perspective," acknowledges without agreeing. "That's an interesting point," recognizes their input without commitment. "I'll consider that," suggests openness without promising change. "Thanks for your concern," appreciates their care without accepting their judgment. Practice the art of strategic delay. When someone demands immediate explanation for your choices, you don't have to respond instantly. "Let me think about that," or "I'll get back to you," gives you time to decide whether any explanation is necessary and, if so, how much to share. Learn to distinguish between people who deserve explanations and those who are simply curious or judgmental. Your intimate partner might deserve insight into major life decisions that affect them. Your boss might need brief updates on work-related choices. Random acquaintances, distant relatives, and casual friends typically deserve only basic courtesy, not detailed justification. Create internal guidelines for what you will and won't explain. Major life decisions might warrant brief explanation to people directly affected. Career choices might require professional justification to supervisors. Personal preferences, lifestyle choices, and individual boundaries should generally be non-negotiable and require no explanation beyond, "This is what I prefer." The practice also involves developing comfort with others, disapproval or confusion. When you stop explaining yourself extensively, some people will be frustrated. They're accustomed to having access to your internal reasoning and may feel shut out when you become more selective. This discomfort is their problem to solve, not your problem to fix through more explanation. Remember that not everyone deserves access to your thought processes, your decision-making methods, your concerns, your fears, your hopes. These are valuable personal resources that should be shared strategically, not distributed freely to anyone who expresses curiosity. Over time, this practice builds genuine inner authority. When you stop seeking external validation for your choices, you develop stronger confidence in your own judgment. When you stop explaining every decision, you start making better decisions because you can't rely on post hoc justification to make poor choices seem reasonable. The advanced practitioner of strategic non-explanation develops what might be called authoritative presence, a quality that commands respect not through dominance or aggression, but through self-contained confidence and clear boundaries. This presence communicates that you are someone who makes thoughtful decisions, owns the consequences, and doesn't require external validation to feel secure in your choices. Advanced implementation involves understanding the nuanced differences between various social and professional contexts. The approach that works in a boardroom might be inappropriate in an intimate relationship. The strategy that builds respect among peers might damage connections with family members. Mastery requires calibrating your level of explanation based on relationship dynamics, stakes involved, and long-term objectives. In leadership positions, the ability to make decisions without extensive explanation becomes particularly valuable. Teams need clear direction more than detailed reasoning. Employees want to understand their role and objectives, not the complete thought process behind strategic decisions. Over-explanation from leaders often creates confusion, undermines confidence, and invites endless questions that distract from execution. The most effective leaders learn to provide just enough context for people to understand their role without revealing the complete strategic picture. We're shifting focus to this market segment, provides direction without explaining competitive intelligence, financial constraints, or other factors that influence the decision. Advanced practitioners also develop sensitivity to when explanation actually serves strategic purposes. Sometimes sharing selected reasoning can build buy-in, demonstrate thoughtfulness, or educate others. The key is making this choice consciously rather than automatically. When you do explain, it's because explanation serves your objectives, not because you feel compelled to justify yourself. The mastery involves learning to read social dynamics accurately. Some people ask questions because they genuinely want to understand and support you. Others ask because they're looking for ammunition to use against you. Still others ask because they're insecure about their own choices and want to compare their reasoning to yours. Developing the ability to distinguish between these motivations allows you to respond appropriately to each situation. In negotiations, the person who explains less often has more power. When you reveal your constraints, priorities, and decision-making process, you give the other party information they can use to their advantage. Strategic ambiguity about your bottom line, your alternatives, and your timeline often leads to better outcomes than transparent explanation of your position. The advanced application also involves understanding how non-explanation affects different personality types. Some people are more comfortable with ambiguity and respect boundaries easily. Others have a strong need to understand everyone else's reasoning and may become frustrated when you don't provide extensive explanations. Learning to manage these different reactions without compromising your boundaries is a crucial skill. Master practitioners develop the ability to redirect conversations away from their personal reasoning toward more productive topics. Instead of explaining why you made a particular choice, you can guide discussion toward implementation, results, or collaborative problem solving. This keeps relationships focused on forward movement rather than backward justification. The ultimate application involves building a reputation as someone whose decisions can be trusted even when the reasoning isn't fully explained. This reputation develops over time through consistent good judgment, reliable follow-through, and honest acknowledgement when you make mistakes. When people learn that your unexplained decisions typically work out well, they stop demanding explanations and start trusting your judgment. This trust-based dynamic is far more sustainable than explanation-based relationships. When people trust your judgment, they don't need to understand every decision. When they only trust your ability to justify your choices, they'll always require explanation. And your authority remains dependent on your communication skills rather than your actual competence. Advanced practitioners also learn to use strategic silence as a tool for gathering information. When you don't fill conversational spaces with explanation, others often fill them with their own thoughts, concerns, and motivations. This can provide valuable intelligence about their priorities, fears, and strategies. The mastery also involves developing comfort with being misunderstood. Not everyone will interpret your actions correctly, and not everyone will approve of your choices. Advanced practitioners accept this reality and focus on results rather than perception management. They understand that trying to control everyone's interpretation of their actions through explanation is both impossible and exhausting. Finally, the highest level of mastery involves helping others develop similar capabilities. When you model healthy boundaries around explanation, you give others permission to do the same. When you demonstrate that it's possible to be respected without constantly justifying yourself, you contribute to a culture where people can focus on performance rather than politics. Returning to Machiavelli's fundamental insight, the wise man does at once what the fool does at last. The wise person makes decisions and sets the terms. The fool, anxious and insecure, tries to narrate the inner workings of every action, seeking approval and validation from people whose opinions shouldn't determine their life direction. Soon, the fool is crowded out of their own life by the voices of others who feel entitled to judge choices that should be entirely personal. Here's your systematic integration challenge. Over the next week, keep careful score. Note every time you feel the urge to explain yourself in conversation, at work, in texts or emails, in social situations, in family interactions. Pause before responding. Edit out 5 words. Edit out 1 sentence. See what happens when you say less and stand by it comfortably. Start with low-stakes situations where the consequences of not explaining are minimal. Practice with casual acquaintances, optional social events, minor personal preferences. Build your comfort with non-explanation gradually before applying it to more significant decisions or relationships. You'll notice several changes as you implement this practice consistently. First, you'll watch respect increase as people begin to see you as someone who owns their choices completely. Second, you'll observe drama decrease as you stop feeding conversational cycles that revolve around justification and criticism. Third, you'll notice curiosity about you sharpen as you become more mysterious and self-contained. Most importantly, you'll gain peace. No one can weaponize information you do not share. No one can use your reasoning against you when you keep it private. No one can manipulate your insecurities when you don't broadcast them as part of your explanations. This transformation requires letting go of the need to be understood by everyone. Most people will never fully understand your choices because they're not living your life, facing your challenges, or pursuing your objectives. Their approval is unnecessary for your success, and their disapproval is irrelevant to your path. The practice also involves accepting responsibility for outcomes without needing to explain how you'll achieve them. When you say you're going to accomplish something, people don't need to understand your methodology. When you set a boundary, others don't need to agree with your reasoning. When you make a change, the world doesn't require a detailed justification for your new direction. You don't owe explanations to people who haven't earned the right to your internal thought processes. Only a clear standard, consistently enacted in reality. Make that your signature approach to life. Let your actions speak louder than your words. Let your results validate your choices, and let your consistency build trust over time. The transformation begins immediately with your next conversation, your next decision, your next opportunity to choose silence over explanation. Your clarity isn't demonstrated through your explanations, but through your results and your unshakable presence. Let others talk, speculate, and demand justification. You keep moving forward, focused on outcomes rather than approval. That's authentic power, Machiavelli style, the power that comes from owning your choices completely, needing no external validation, and building authority through consistent action rather than constant explanation. This is how you reclaim sovereignty over your own life and command genuine respect from others who learn to trust your judgment rather than judge your reasoning. The choice is yours. Continue seeking permission and approval through explanation, or claim full ownership of your decisions and let the results speak for themselves. Your future authority depends on this fundamental shift in how you relate to your own choices and other people's opinions about them.